After 1 year as Carolina Panthers GM, has Dan Morgan proved that he can build a winner in Carolina? We'll talk about it right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, the part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Fridays throughout the entirety of the offseason, I'm right here answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions here on the show. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get your questions in for this week's edition of the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. And on today's show, let's go back and look at year one in totality of Dan Morgan as Carolina Panthers general manager. Over the last week or so, we've talked about all 9 trades Dan Morgan has made: the Brian Burns trade, the Deontay Johnson trade saga, the draft night trades. We looked at his free agency signings, whether those signings have worked out or not. And also on yesterday's show, looked at his initial draft class, not just the 7 guys that he drafted throughout the NFL draft, but also the undrafted free agents like Damani Richardson and like Jalen Coker, who Dan Morgan signed, some diamonds in the rough. And rarely have we seen, whether it's been Marty Hurney 1.0 or 2.0, Dave Gettleman or Scott Fitterer, rarely have we seen a Carolina Panthers GM be able to find players on day 3 of the draft, or before there was a day 3, rounds 4 through 7, and then find guys that were undrafted free agents and come in immediately and be impact players. So bravo to Dan Morgan for doing that. So let's look back at the trades that he made. Let's look back at free agency. Let's look back at the draft and come to a conclusion, or at least a thought, of whether Dan is the right guy for the job moving forward. I'm not saying fire Dan Morgan, but has he shown enough for you to have faith that he can build a winner, for us to have faith that he can build a winner here long-term in Carolina? As David Tepper told us once upon a time, Rome was not built in a day. It takes time, short-term suffering for long-term success, sustained success. What has eluded Carolina, it has eluded David Tepper primarily since he got rid of Ron Rivera back at the end of the 2019 season. And it feels like now, with Dan Morgan and Dave Canales, Brant Tillis as well, that the Panthers are finally headed down the right direction. So looking back at his trades once again, let's focus in on really what was the biggest trade that Dan Morgan has made so far as the Panthers GM. And once he took over as the GM, he had a very important decision to make. Now, well, of course, the first decision he had to make was who was going to be the head coach. And his old buddy, a guy who was his office mate back in Seattle, Dave Canales, it was his pick, David Tepper's pick, the organization's pick to be the Panthers' next head coach. But then after that, Dan Morgan had to figure out, what was he going to do with Brian Burns? Was he going to give him the franchise tag, paying him $24 million here in Carolina? Was he going to trade him? Was he going to extend him? Dan had to make a decision. The first big decision he made was to, in fact, give Brian Burns, really slap the franchise tag on Brian Burns, paying him $24 million in 2024. And also, that was going to be $24 million cap hit for the Panthers, restricting potentially what they could do in free agency. But they were not able to come to terms as far as a long-term deal. The two parties were too far apart. And Dan was a part of that Scott Fitterer regime that opted to not take those reported 2 first-round picks plus another, I believe, day 2 pick from the Los Angeles Rams for the services of Brian Burns a couple of years ago. He was in favor of keeping Burns. And once Panthers did that, they showed Burns what their value was for him, but yet they weren't willing to ever pay him the amount of money that he wanted. A team that was willing to do that were the New York Giants. And of course, Dan Morgan had a relationship with Joe Shane dating back to their time there in Buffalo, where he came under Brandon Beane to be the assistant general manager under then general manager Scott Fitterer a couple of years ago. And they came to terms on a deal that was a second and 2 fifths. And that's not a deal that had anyone excited about it, considering that the Rams were willing to give the Panthers 2 first-rounders and a day 2 pick a year and a half before that. And Carolina decided, no, actually, we're good. But the situation with him being on a franchise tag, not having that much time to negotiate a deal, led to the Panthers not getting the kind of deal that they wanted. But it's not about necessarily the compensation. Because certainly, as we've seen in the past, when guys like Russell Wilson have been traded, Deshaun Watson have been traded, and you look at what the Panthers gave up to get the number 1 overall pick to select Bryce Young, it matters what you do with those picks. You may have a plethora of first-round picks, but if you don't utilize them and good players, it doesn't really matter if you won or lost a trade. We don't know who won or lost a trade until down the road. But looking at the way the Panthers utilized those picks that they got from New York, man, what a move it was for Dan Morgan. So let's go back over what exactly came out of the Panthers moving on from Brian Burns by getting a second and 2 fifth-round picks from the New York Giants a year ago. Looking at pick 141. That was a 2024 fifth-round pick. That eventually became Cedric Van Pran Granger, the center at the University of Georgia. He's a Buffalo Bill now. How did he become a Buffalo Bill? With Panthers, they had pick number 33. That was the first pick in the second round, plus number 141, which they got from the Giants. They sent that over to Buffalo in exchange for pick number 32, the final pick of the first round, and pick number 200. That's there in the 6th round, and that allowed them, of course, to get Xavier Legette. Having, though, pick number 141 helped them be able to trade up to get Xavier Legette because they already had an extra second rounder. So they felt good about that. And they also were able to get Legette and, of course, the 5th-year option. The Panthers then had 2 fifth-round picks to utilize along with number 142. So they already had 2 second-round picks plus 2 fifth-round picks. And Dan Morgan has a philosophy of having a pick in every single round of the draft. So by making that trade, that allowed them to get Xavier Legette and a 5th-year option as well. Look at the other second-round pick that Carolina had. That's pick number 39 there in 2024. That ended up being Braden Fisk, defensive tackle out of Florida State. He is now a Los Angeles Ram, and he is one hell of a player. There's a run on defensive tackles. The Rams wanted one. Carolina obliged by having number 39 overall. They sent that to the Rams in exchange for number 52, a 5th-rounder that was 155, and a 2nd-rounder in 2025. And you may remember Carolina did not have a 2nd-round pick in 2025 because of the trade they made with Chicago back in March of 2023 to get up to number 1 overall to later on select Bryce Young. They owned number 33 in the draft, as we know, in which they used to trade up for Xavier Legette. Having those 2 2nd-round picks allowed them the ability to feel comfortable enough to trade back later on in the 2nd round. So they used one to trade up. They had another one where it's like, okay, we already got our guy. We can trade back with a team that is desperate to get a defensive tackle, be in position to take Braden Fisk. And of course, they picked up that 2nd rounder, which they lost when trading up to number 1 with the Bears to draft Bryce Young. More that came out of it when looking at it. The Panthers later used number 52 and number 155, which they got from the Rams in that trade back, picks that they acquired because of the original picks that they got from the Brian Burns trade. They used that to then later trade up to get Jonathan Brooks. Then you look at pick number 200, which again, they sent 33 and 141, which they got from the Giants trade. They got back number 200 in the 6th round from Buffalo. They used that pick from the Buffalo Bills to then get Jaden Crumby, defensive tackle out of Mississippi State. So looking at the overall return based off of the picks that the Panthers received, then later used to trade back and being able to have the flexibility by having multiple seconds, multiple 5th rounders, this was the overall return so far. Not was, is the overall return so far for the Carolina Panthers. Xavier Legette, thanks to getting pick number 141. Jonathan Brooks, thanks to having pick number 39. Jaden Crumby, thanks to having pick number 141. They have a 2025 2nd-round pick. That's thanks to having pick number 39 and being able to have the flexibility to keep that. That's also 2025 5th-round pick that they got coming up this upcoming year. And, oh, by the way, $24 million of cap space. And I had a listener DM me on Twitter at Julian Council last week bringing up the fact that not only did the Panthers benefit with the Brian Burns trade because they got Leggett, they got Brooks, they got Cromedy, they got the second-round pick, they got the fifth-round pick, but also it opened up $24 million of cap space to allow them to go out there and spend the kind of money they spent on Robert Hunt and on Damian Lewis and later on down the road on Jadeveon Clowney and all of those players that they brought in to help the offensive line and try to help the defense and help replace Brian Burns in free agency in 2024. What did the Giants get out of it? Well, they got Brian Burns. They gave him a 5-year deal worth $150 million max. That's $30 million per year with $87.5 million guaranteed. And they also got Tyrone Tracy Jr., the running back out of Purdue, who, by the way, as we know, back in Munich, fumbled there in overtime, setting up the game-winning field goal for Eddie Pinheiro, and the Panthers getting their back-to-back wins and remaining undefeated when they go overseas. So the Panthers, Dan Morgan, moved on from Brian Burns, got Leggett, got Brooks, got Cromedy, second-round pick coming up next year when they didn't have one, a fifth-round pick coming up this year, which 25, I meant second-round pick this year, a 2025 fifth-round pick coming up, and then open up $24 million of cap space. That's what you want to see. When you originally saw a second, a fifth, and a fifth, that's it? That's all? No, actually, it was Xavier Leggett. It was Jonathan Brooks. It was Jaden Cromedy, 2025 second-round pick, 2025 fifth-round pick, and $24 million cap space to allow you to go out there and to sign Robert Hunt, sign Damian Lewis, sign Clowney, and sign some other players and have that flexibility once the new league year began for the Carolina Panthers to build through free agency. Well, the Giants got, Brian Burns, an expensive contract, and a running back who fumbled the game away there in Munich. All of the trades that Dan Morgan made his first year as Panthers GM made sense. Getting Deontay Johnson and moving on from Dante Jackson to get a number one receiver, move on from a corner you didn't really want anymore, that made sense. Getting rid of Deontay Johnson, even if it wasn't the kind of price that you were hoping it would be, it made sense because he was a malcontent. And we've seen how things have worked out. Cut in Baltimore, cut in Houston, picked up by the Ravens, but only using that to get a comp pick. He's not anybody that anybody wants on their roster. And, well, that led to them getting Mike Jackson and trading to get Mike Jackson when they needed a corner. Made a lot of sense. You had a seventh rounder who you weren't going to keep around anymore. Getting rid of Jonathan Mingo, getting a fourth rounder for Jonathan Mingo. How was that even possible? How was there a team who was a sucker enough to do something like that? Oh, that's right. Jerry Jones and the Dallas Cowboys exist. So that obviously made sense. Even going up to get Xavier Leggett there and the fifth-year option, it makes sense. It wasn't my favorite selection, but they got the fifth-year option. They got a receiver, something that they needed to do, accepting the Rams and the Jets trade offers to move back, get more compensation, and then later on go out there and get Trevin Wallace. And then they eventually use some of those picks also to get Shaw Smith-Wade. Can't be upset about that. The only trade you can look back of the 9 that he made that was questionable, and I suppose the pick swap with Baltimore, so if you want to do it, there's a trade and a half. That's 7.5 out of 9 trades. Pretty good hit rate, I would say. The only questionable one really, truly to me would be like the Jonathan Brooks. Trading back up there to 46, get a running back who has a torn ACL, and then unfortunately things have not worked out in Brooks's or Morgan's or the organization's favor so far. But overall, those trades that he made, all 9 of them, I don't know how you can complain about the job Dan Morgan's done so far. So trade so far, I feel like Dan Morgan's showing you that this is a guy who's pretty astute, has good relationships in the league, and can go out there and what looks like win a trade for the Carolina Panthers. Now, it's not just trades that GMs do. They also got to make sure they sign the proper guys in free agency. And looking back at the free agent class that Dan Morgan had, there were some busts, but there was also some guys that were going to hit and be starters again next year. And compared to what Scott Fitterer did in his last year, night and day. We'll go back and once again look at the free agents that Dan Morgan signed here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and a variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings, whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs. FanDuel has got you covered. And speaking of FanDuel and the odds this weekend, the Washington Commanders are 6.5-point underdogs on the road in Philadelphia for the NFC Championship. Buffalo, KC, Allen Mahomes, part 9. The Bills are getting 1.5 points as they are on the road as underdogs to the Chiefs there. 6:30 at Arrowhead Stadium for the AFC title game. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Let's go back and look one final time at the first free agency class that Dan Morgan signed here in Carolina as the Panthers GM. And going into the free agency, Carolina knew what they had to do as far as trying to fix the offensive line. And we wondered, would they be able to do that? Dan Morgan came out and was very clear that left tackle was going to be Ike Ekwonu again. He was committed to making things work with Ike Ekwonu. And as you recall, he was the assistant general manager when Carolina drafted Ike Ekwonu. He was head of scouting here when Carolina went out there and drafted Ike. So that's a guy that he loved and wanted to put faith in even after a very rocky second year in the NFL at that left tackle spot. Already had Taylor Moton. They were deciding whether they were going to have Austin Corbett stay at guard or go to center. They were certainly interested in signing a center, but they had 3 guys that they felt confident about, but they wanted to upgrade that interior, and especially knowing that they had a short quarterback, wanted to do the whole Saints Drew Brees model and protect the interior where, honestly, whether you're short or not, you get pressure in your face quickly, you're going to have problems as a quarterback in the NFL. So they knew they had to fix the offensive line. And boy, Dan Morgan threw money at it. Having that extra $24 million cap space, thanks to Brian Burns no longer being Carolina Panther, he committed on the very first day of free agency $153 million to Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis to be his starting right and left guards, respectively, and $89.2 million of that 153 fully guaranteed. All that money hit in direct deposit for Robert Hunt and for Damian Lewis. Life-changing money for their families. Dan Morgan said enough is enough. We went through the 7 different left guards, 8 different right guards last year. We're not doing it again. And we're going to upgrade the talent level. We're going to have Chandler back. We're going to have Brady back. We're going to move Austin inside at center. We're going to be deeper than we were a year ago. And we're going to be better, more talented than we were on the interior of the offensive line. And while we all saw how it worked out, bravo to Dan Morgan for going out there and getting those guys who were just great free agents, played in 16 games apiece, did not have to worry about really injuries. Hunt missed 1 game at the end of the year. Lewis missed 1 game in week 4 against Cincinnati. Other than that, they were out there healthy, just road grading for the Carolina Panthers and keeping Bryce Young upright after a year where he was sacked 62 times. Looking at the rest of the classes, we already did. Like, there were failed free agents, obviously, and that's going to happen every year. You're not going to bat 100 when it comes to the guys that you sign in March, just about who you miss on and who you don't. And they missed on some guys in the secondary, but look at who they missed on in the secondary. Jordan Fuller, Nick Scott. Well, why are they here in Carolina? Oh, well, they played for the Rams, and who used to coach for the Rams? Jero Avero, who we know, it's been pretty well reported that he's the one who wanted DJ Johnson, and DJ Johnson has done nothing in Carolina. He's also the one who wanted to not utilize Frankie Louvu in the right spot, where Louvu decided to take less money, and now he's playing for an NFC title game. Also, Jeremy Chin was not utilized in the way that we thought he would be in Carolina, and that's Jero Avero who did all that. And of course, he's still here, and we've talked about it. We're not going to talk about it anymore. He's going to be here in Carolina at least for the next season as Panthers defensive coordinator. We have seen that his personnel decisions have not necessarily been the most astute. So those two, I put that on a DC. The other one that was certainly a failure was Dane Jackson, and you could question would it have been a failure had he been able to stay healthy, not have the hamstring, the Panthers not need to trade for Mike Jackson. Maybe they do it regardless, which I think would have been smart had they made that trade anyways. But he was supposed to play on the outside, not play at nickel. He played on the outside with the Buffalo Bills, was not a slot guy, and we saw really struggled in the slot, struggled to tackle, a 23.3 missed tackle percentage compared to what Shaw Smith-Wade, who replaced him, had. A 4.9, was the best of the secondary players in Carolina in 2024. Dane was never healthy, missed 9 games. It's kind of tough to be a successful player when you're just out there, not on the field, but in the injury tent. and in the medical room all the time trying to rehab. So that's the one that was a failure. And that's Dan Morgan banging on the table way back when in Buffalo in 7th round saying, we got to get this guy from Pitt to come out here and help us out. Worked in Buffalo, did not work in Carolina. Other than that, look at the guys that he signed. Robert Hunt, Damian Lewis certainly have lived up to their contracts for the most part. Hunt maybe not as much so, but still, like the guy's starting. Like, is he ever going to live up to $100 million? Maybe, maybe not. But his value, it's certainly worth a lot more than that when you look at what he's been able to do for the locker room as well. So Hunt, Lewis, you're not regretting those decisions. Clowney, even when looking back at it the other day, I was like, you know what? He didn't come in and be some superstar like I think some people make him out to be, because he's more of a name than kind of like the player that you would expect that name to be. He's famous, but he's not like like not an MVP, but like he's not a Pro Bowler. And he says when he's healthy, he's a Pro Bowler, but that's not true. He's a solid player for Carolina. Didn't really make him impact that much in the pass rush game, but still, Tideva and Clowney, when you look at Pro Football Reference, which we talked about the other day, pretty similar stats to what he put up in Baltimore, except for the 4 less sacks that he had this past season compared to the 9.5 that he had a year ago. So 9.5 to 5.5, but the pressures are the same according to Pro Football Reference. The tackles are pretty close. TFLs are the same. Got basically the same guy. Now you paid him a lot more money than Baltimore did. Either way, hard to say it didn't really work out, and he's probably going to be back next year. A'Shawn Robinson was the best of the worst defensive line in football, and he should be back with Derek Brown there to help him out next year, plus somebody else new. Josie Jewell had his ups and downs, certainly better after the injury once he came back against Denver, getting that fresh mountain air into his lungs. Maybe that helped out. And David Moore, more of a, no pun intended, more of a Dave Canales pick, as he was a Seattle guy, was in Tampa last year. Dave had his best year since leaving Seattle after the 2020 season and going to Carolina, where he didn't even make the team, as he was trying to be the number 3 receiver. You got 6 guys right there who you sign. Now, again, like Robinson, Jewell, probably more of the DC than him, but Hunt, Lewis, Clowney, that sounds like Dan Morgan to me. David Moore, probably more of the whole situation with Dave Canales. But the 3 guys that you paid the highest amount of money, looks like those worked out the way that you were hoping to. Maybe they thought more was going to happen, but kind of hard to argue against what his expectations probably were and what things actually ended up being. And you compare that, 6 guys that can come back and contribute for you next year from the free agency class that you signed, compared to looking at Scott Fitterer's last free agency class. Shai Tuttle gave him 3 years, $19.5 million, and he has been awful upfront, unfortunately. Von Bell, 3 years, $22.5 million. He was here for 1 season, wasn't necessarily a scheme fit. Andy Dalton got 2 years, $10 million. He's somebody that actually has been a really good presence in the locker room, helped Carolina win a game earlier this season on the road against Las Vegas, and what a Sunday that was. That was money well spent. Hayden Hurst got 3 years, $21 million. Was one and done, did nothing. Miles Sanders got 4 years, $25 million. For a running back, you gotta be kidding me. He didn't do anything at all for Carolina. Deshaun Williams was here for 1 year, wasn't great, came back this past year in a more ancillary role, still not ideal. Adam Thielen, though, turned out to be a really good signing, 3 years, $25 million, and would love for him to come back again next year. Justin McCray was a liability. DJ Chark was terrible. Eric Rowe, I don't even remember what he did in Carolina. You look at that free agency class compared to the one that Scott Fitterer, that Dan Morgan signed. Morgan did a much better job than his predecessor and his buddy Scott did as far as signing free agents in 2024 compared to 2023. And Dan was aggressive. He went out there, spent $153 million on offensive guards, but he was smart in the decisions that he made. And I'd expect the same to be the case again this offseason, as he's already come out and said that we're going to be aggressive, but we're going to be smart. And they certainly need to be, as he's already shown in one offseason, he fixed the offensive line. Can he fix the entire defense? I don't know. Can he fix the defensive line? Getting Derek Brown back certainly would help. Can he fix secondary? That would be nice as well. We've seen him do it before. We'll see if he can do it again. And overall, compared to what the guy previously did, kind of hard to argue against what Dan Morgan did in his first year as a GM when it came to signing free agents. What about the draft? Talked about that yesterday. We'll talk about it again briefly and then look at it all in totality. Overall, is Dan Morgan the guy moving forward who's going to build a winner in Carolina? Let's talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. Therapy is a game changer. It can help you manage stress, improve sleep, and communicate more effectively. But finding the right therapist and fitting sessions into a busy schedule can be a challenge. That's where Talkspace comes in. Talkspace, the leading virtual therapy provider, makes getting the help you need easy, accessible, and affordable. With Talkspace, signing up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist who fits your needs, usually within 48 hours, and it's convenient. You can have sessions from the comfort of your own home, even message your therapist in between sessions. Plus, Talkspace is covered by many insurance plans, and for most insured members, there's a $0 copay. It's never been easier to prioritize your mental health. As a listener of this podcast, you can get $80 off your first month with Talkspace when you go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80 to get $80 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code SPACE80. We've looked back at free agency for Dan Morgan, look back at the trades that he made, and really the big trade, Brian Burns, and what's all come of that for Carolina. And right now, feeling like the Panthers have won that trade. Let's wait and see what happens with that second-round pick in 2025, the fifth-round pick as well, and what the Panthers do with those and who they end up being, and if that can help this team moving forward as Dan Morgan looks to build a winner in Carolina. Looking again at the draft, did that on yesterday's show, just grading the selections and the first and second round picks, that being Xavier Legette, the wide receiver out of South Carolina, and Jonathan Brooks, running back out of Texas. Those are to be determined. You can't sit here and say that Legette has been a bust, because obviously that's not the case. And I have seen the hyperbole on Twitter that people have been talking about, especially when Legette has a drop that he had against Philadelphia. No, he did not do it. Ladd McConkey did, who was drafted a couple spots behind him. No, he did not do what Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors did, which I don't think anybody expected that to happen. Brian Thomas Jr. as well was a better player. I guess he didn't really put the numbers at LSU that necessarily Legette put up a year ago at South Carolina, but still, he was higher regarded, and he played well. So it's going to be a work in progress to get Legette to the spot where maybe he's the number one receiver in Carolina. I don't necessarily believe that's going to happen, and it certainly would be disappointing if a player that you select in the first round that you traded up for to get that fifth-year option does not end up doing that. But if he's able to play 5 years, if the Panthers, after the next 2 seasons, believe in the offseason come May of 2027 that it's worth exercising that fifth-round pick, I mean, kind of hard to say that fifth-year option, rather, kind of hard to say that wasn't a success as far as the pick goes when it comes to Xavier Legette. And you look at the rest of it, they got starters in the third round. Trevin Wallace traded back, got him. And he started out of necessity, but he came out and I thought he played fairly well considering what the expectations should have been. Fourth round, you got a tight end who had to start from day one because of injuries, and he held up his own. Now, there's some issues early on in the season. He started to play really well, got hurt, wasn't much of a factor down the stretch, but you clearly can see that finally it looks like the Panthers have a tight end who is a threat in the pass game, and they can finally replace Greg Olsen. Will he ever have the 3 straight 1,000-yard receiving season as Greg Olsen had? I don't know. I don't necessarily want that to be the case as far as, like, I would love for the Panthers to actually have reliable receivers. That was not the case when Greg was around, and that's not to take away from Greg at all because he was outstanding. But if there was more options, then maybe Cam wouldn't have to lean on Greg so much. So I don't want it necessarily to be the case for Bryce. I want to be able to spread it around, but I want to see Sanders obviously put up some numbers. Fifth rounder, got Shaw Smith-Wade, got a starting job. You love that. 2 UDFAs and Jalen Coker, and looking also at Damani Richardson. Like that right there, there's 7 players when healthy in Legette, Brooks, Wallace, Sanders, Shaw Smith-Wade, Coker, and Richardson, who, when healthy, those guys can be contributors. That's a strong foundation that's been built coming off of that 2024 draft class. How many draft classes in recent memory, and just Panthers history, period, have the Panthers had 7 guys who, when healthy, could help them? Now, of course, the when healthy thing's a big question. Like, if Brooks and they're healthy, then, well, that's one less guy. But 6 is still pretty good. Let's go back to, 2021, man. Let me go pull that up real quick. Like the 2021 Panthers draft class had 11 guys that were selected. 11. And what did they end up doing? J.C. Horn's still here. He's going to get a big extension this offseason. Awesome to see. Terrace Marshall Jr., no clue where he's at. Brady Christensen was helpful, obviously. Good player, I think. Likely not going to be around. Tommy Trimble is a starter, sometimes not a starter. but he's fine. Chuba Hubbard turned out to be a really good player, like Davion Nixon, gone. Keith Taylor, gone. Deontay Brown, gone. Shai Smith, gone. Thomas Fletcher, hilarious, gone. Bill Hoskins, gone. You're looking at, of those 11, Horn, Trimble, but Horn and Hubbard for sure are here next year. 2 out of the 11 for sure. And then maybe Trimble. We'll see. I think that would be nice. And in Christensen, I would bet that's gone. So 3 of the 11 will be coming back. But of those 3, it's Horn and Hubbard who are really building blocks, not Trimble. So 2 out of the 11 guys in that draft class that we marveled at because of the way that Scott Fitterer maneuvered the draft board of all the trade backs and getting all that compensation going into it, I believe, only 6 picks. Only 2 of the 11 worked out. And so far, we'll see. We'll see whether Shai Smith-Wade and Coker and those other guys work out but guys that were drafted. We'll see. But so far, got 7 players that you can look at and think in the future, those guys can help the Panthers win games. Have not been able to say that a ton of times. So overall, can Dan Morgan build a winner in Carolina? I think he can. I look at the trade that he made so far Burns trade, but looking at all the trades, they've made a lot of sense. Free agency signings, collaborative effort. I wonder if he's going to be more strict as far as it's going to be him and Brant Tillis handling all of that as far as the evaluations go and his scouts. And then you look at the draft. 1 draft class so far looks to be pretty impressive for Carolina. I don't know how you don't look at all 3 facets of that as being the Panthers GM in 1 year and not come away thinking that, yes, Dan Morgan, who was an outstanding player for this organization, dealt with concussions that really led him to hang it up. This is a guy who now has come back here to Carolina who looks like someone who can be a long-term GM and have far more success than we've seen in the past. Now, like Marty Herney had plenty of good teams. Dave Gettleman, he built good teams here in Carolina. Like those guys certainly deserve their due. But again, we have never here in Carolina seen a team have back-to-back winning seasons, 30 seasons. And at no point in the 30-season history of the Carolina Panthers organization have they ever had back-to-back winning seasons. Dan Morgan, from what he's done so far, the foundation that he's laid, the culture they're trying to build within that front office and in that building, he feels like the guy who can finally do that. Now, they got a little ways to get there, but still, I'm encouraged. I think you should be as well. So please let me know over on Twitter at Julian Council, and I guess in the comments as well here on YouTube, what you think about Dan Morgan and if he has proven that he can build a winner in Carolina. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe or follow the show free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Friday I'm back answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter to get them in. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding. And on tomorrow's show, going to take a look at Dave Canales. Still trying to figure out how I want to do it, whether it's going to be a series like Dan Morgan, but Dave Canales will be a topic discussion on Thursday, and I will talk to you then.